Welcome to Creative in Tech, a podcast show powered by ReadSpeaker.AI. I'm your host, Carrie Roberts, and I'm the brand evangelist for North America at ReadSpeaker.AI. And this show is all about highlighting the various brands, people, and organizations that are creatively using one of the fastest growing spaces in technology, artificial intelligence. And today we have two very special guests as part of our leadership series. We have Geoff Tuff. He is a principal at Deloitte, and we have Steve Goldbach, a principal and chief strategy officer at Deloitte. We're chatting about how to look forward, take action, and thrive with innovation, which is part of their new book, Provoke. So welcome, gentlemen. Excited to have you here today.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
So I want to start off with just the two of you before we get into your book. I'm curious how the two of you met. You know, this is not the first book you've written, and why you've decided to start writing books together.
Sure. Well, why don't I start with that, and I'll ask Steve to pile on, and maybe a continuation of that question is, why do we continue writing books together, which is a question I often ponder. But so Steve and I were actually just chatting about this. I think we met about 25 years ago. We both share a heritage in a strategy consulting firm called Monitor Group, which is where both of us kind of grew up in consulting. Monitor was acquired by Deloitte almost 9 years ago at this point, which is how we both came to be at Deloitte. But we kind of cut our teeth in this space at Monitor, and we kind of did some work here and there together over time. I think we found that we shared a few similar interests, and we certainly thought about the world in the right way. So when the opportunity presented itself, it wasn't too hard to say, sure, let's go ahead and try it.
Yeah, and maybe I'll pick up on how we decided to write together. So there was a moment in Chicago where Geoff and I were facilitating a working session for a group of other Deloitte partners, and we were on a break and we were just catching up. And Geoff had been published a couple times in Harvard Business Review and had a blog that he was writing. And I said, hey, we should do some writing together. And I had in my head at the time, that we would write an article together and get it published. And Geoff says to me, I remember very vividly, he's like, hey, if you want to write, you can just be like a guest blogger for me at one point on my blog. And I basically
that was my attempt to the brush off, but it didn't work very well.
and I was like, nah, I don't really feel like doing just a quick blog. And as it turned out, there was some interest in a follow-on book to the part of the firm that does innovation, and we went from there. And we just enjoy writing with each other. This particular book was written entirely on Zoom. So the first time we got together and talked about the book in person was when we were doing some of the promotional photography after we had both been vaccinated. So it was one of those experiments, and it seemed to work.
I love that. And I had told both of you, I read the book, and for those listening and watching, I really loved it because it was not only an easy read, but it was an enjoyable and humorous read. And I think a lot of times we read business books and sometimes they're very serious, and it's filled with a lot of great information, which we're going to touch on today, but it's just a very enjoyable read as well, with so many anecdotes. So I thank you both kind of for including that. Impressive that you did it a lot on Zoom as well.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I think if your listeners discover anything about me and Steve through the course of this, I think you'll find that we don't really take ourselves that seriously, and we definitely did not set out to write a boring business book. So I'm glad that was your impression.
Yeah.
Yes. No, thank you. So we're talking about this book again today, Provoke. You had one previously called Detonate. And in it, you had asked, as you put, organizations to selectively demolish the foundations of past successes to allow for forward progress. And so with this new book, your focus is really about looking forward and working through the natural human instincts that keep people frozen in place and actually doing something. And so in your book, you write, and I like to pull out kind of real quotes here, you wrote, in general, we miss trends not because we aren't looking, but because our brain processes the raw data of what we see through an unconscious filter of our own experiences. Unless you consciously learn how to turn off that filter, it can be hard to see something right in front of your nose. I'd love for you to describe a little bit about what that means. And if you can, kind of share a part of the story in your book that kind of goes around the idea of the 1.75%.
Sure. I'll pick that up. The idea is that we are all subject to basic human cognitive biases. And there's a number of these biases that have been popularized by other researchers, like the status quo bias or the availability bias or the affect heuristic bias, which is one that comes into play in the story that I'm about to tell. But what these biases basically do is filter the information that we see in the world that we then process to draw conclusions from. And because of those, they're natural biases. They're not because we are stupid or evil, or we're just all subject to them as human beings. So we can't get around them. So being aware that they exist allows leaders to take action to mitigate the fact that we are all subject to these biases. So what the story that you're referencing is about 12 years ago. When we were both at Monitor, we had done some work in the video and telecommunications business, so the distribution of video content to our homes. And we had a curious finding that was surprising to both the company that we were doing the work for and us, which was there was a segment of less than 2%, 1.75%, that didn't want video programming as part of their packages, but they did want really, really high quality internet. And normally the explanation of when someone doesn't want something was, well, maybe there's a price issue, maybe there's an affordability, so let's look at indicators of income and affordability. But actually, this group didn't show any signs of having issues of affordability. They just didn't want the video programming. They wanted what was described at the time as just naked internet, and that wasn't really an offer that a lot of these companies had. They like to bundle, video and internet and phone, and so we took it to a non-competitive company based on our client's request, and we took it to a senior executive there, and he sort of behaved in what we would describe as a bit of an arrogant fashion, and like this was such not a big deal. And I remember him saying 1.75%, why would I care? And that's an example of the affect heuristic bias, where it's just not big enough to draw out an emotional response. It didn't elicit any pain or any creation of concern about loss because it was small. But it was an indication that perhaps there was a group of customers that might, in the future, want to do something quite different with their bundling behavior, and that was a bellwether of future challenges for that particular business. So it's hard to, even if you see it in front of your nose, to react to it in a way that's consistent with the potential threat it might be.
Yeah, I think you're right. We all kind of have these unconscious biases we're not aware of, and it seems so small. And, as I was reading this story in your book, I was like, I'm that 1.75%. Even now, but even back then, of like, well, I'm not really watching TV. I just want the internet. I'm using Netflix at the time. Now we have a lot more options. And so it was just kind of very poignant as I was reading that, which kind of brings me to, your kind of core hypothesis for this book is this idea of when an if becomes a when, and the nature of a leader's response and how that must change. So this is kind of a good example of like, okay, well, it's not a big deal. So can you talk about kind of what this core idea of if to when actually means?
Sure, yeah. So I think I'll start with just the underlying reality of the context and the world we're living in today. So 12 years ago, the world was a very different place in a lot of different ways. We still had all the same human biases that Steve just talked about, but change wasn't really accelerating like it is today. We have forever, as a human race, as a society, we've lived in a time of linear change. And what we've started to see over the course of the last decade, and certainly over the course of the last 5 to 6 years, is a much higher impact of exponential change in all sorts of different ways. And I'll save you the treatise on exponential change, and just suffice to say for the moment that there are lots of things in the world today that are demonstrating that they are on an exponential curve in terms of development, in part because they sit on computing power, and computing power has now been demonstrably shown to be on an exponential curve. So change is accelerating. Back then, the arrogant executive, he kind of blew it by not paying attention to the 1.75%. But had he paid attention to it shortly after that, he could have course corrected and done something differently. Increasingly, we're finding that you can't actually have time to course correct in the face of exponential change. And so what we advocate in the book, and our core premise, is that with exponential change comes a shift in the world of what we're trying to do to make the right decisions in business. No longer are we just trying to manage risk out of decisions by using historical data to do better analysis and make better decisions. Increasingly, we're having to act in the face of uncertainty. And when we talk about that, I especially given the experience that many of us have had in the pandemic, all of us feel viscerally what uncertainty feels like. So the notion of the if to when is that uncertainty is all around us. It will continue to be around us. But the very first step we need to make or very first realization is that every uncertainty at some point resolve. It may take a long time to resolve. It may resolve very quickly, but there's a phase change in any uncertain trend where something goes from being a question of if it's going to happen to simply being a matter of when it's going to happen. And so Provoke is a book about how executives, how leaders of all stripes can actually get out in front of that phase change, how they can recognize when an uncertainty is resolving from if to when, and position themselves. And there's a variety of different strategies to make as we go through that phase change, position themselves in a way where they can provoke the future that they want for themselves and for their organization.
Yeah, I love that. And we're going to talk more today in this conversation, but definitely the book breaks down in much more details and with images as well to kind of help facilitate that a little bit. You also suggest that we should focus primarily on the kinds of trends that define or redefine industries and less of the trends which segments industries. Can you talk about what that means and why it's more important to focus on certain kinds of trends?
Yeah, and it's not that segmenting trends is not the trends that segment industries are unimportant. It's just that the risk posed to a company whose business model is contingent on a particular trend being in place. It's critical to know when there might be challenges to something that's fundamental to your business model. So let's imagine an industry. Let's think about the automotive business and the potential change that's afoot with autonomous driving. And we know that many companies in the automotive space are working on a variety of plans for autonomous driving. But because autonomous driving is something that would redefine what it means for mobility in general, there are companies who are working on it from well outside of the traditional automotive business, while the automotive companies are also working on it because it's going to redefine the capabilities that are required to compete in that space. So it's critical to focus on those trends versus some of the trends that segment the auto business today, whether it's the kind of vehicle or the fuel economy or the speed or the horsepower or the space in the car. Those are all important to compete within a certain parameter, but it's the ones that redefine industries that have the potential to be completely disruptive and allow in a new suite of competition. So this is a good example of one where we're probably not quite yet resolved as to whether autonomous driving is a question of when versus if. It's probably still at that early part of the phase change, but it's probably not uncertain that it eventually will come to pass in some way, shape, or form. And so that's why it's critical for the future of that business that everyone have a plan for how they might compete in that particular future.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I actually want to continue with you or go to Geoff for a second, because you asked a question in the book. Now, you said it much more eloquently than I think most of us do. But again, as I was reading it, I was like, yes, I think we've all asked this question. And you said, why is it that herd mentality tends to favor caution and incrementalism instead of being bold? After Steve just talked about, hey, here's kind of signs of showing we need to kind of move forward. Why do you think we have this problem? And I'm curious what your answer to that question you asked is now.
Sure. Yeah. And I think to state the obvious, perhaps herd mentality, if you go back to the original meaning of it, herd mentality is meant to represent safety in numbers. It historically, take a herd of animals on the African plains who don't want to get eaten by lions. It's better to be in a big pack all moving together than standing out all alone, because if you're standing out all alone, you're probably going to get taken out first. The reality is that for a very long time, this goes back to the whole shift from linear to exponential. For a very long time, it actually made sense to all essentially do the same thing, because change was not moving at such a pace that you had to be bold, you had to do things differently. And that's why, for example, in a lot of industries, there's something called a fast follower strategy, where someone else takes on the cost and does something and creates a new path. And then if you can just follow quickly behind them at a slightly lower cost, then you might actually stand a chance of catching up with them. That's been a commonly accepted, valid strategy for a very long time. One of the things that Steve and I question in the book is whether or not fast follower strategies actually still can create advantage, because we have shifted to a time where actually it might be safer to stand out, to do something different from the crowd. And one of the things that we often encourage our readers and listeners to do is to question, is there more risk in staying the same, in doing the same thing we always have, or more risk in doing something differently? And as you might imagine, we believe that actually, while historically it's been generally true that the status quo feels safer, and generally doing something dramatically different feels really risky, we actually think we've shifted to a time where the status quo is more risky than trying something different, but how you try it and what you do is what is so critical in making that move.
Yeah, I like that. I think you're right. We're in the technology space. So, as you know, innovation technology is moving extremely fast. So you can't just sit around and wait. So it makes sense in what you're saying. And kind of along the lines, again, we here at ReadSpeaker, we make synthetic voices. So we fall under that kind of conversational AI space. And when I think about AI in general, you have a group of people that are excited, they're using it, they're taking risks, they're trying it. You have a group of people that are completely against it. And then you have a group of people that are just confused. They're not sure kind of what to do, so they don't take action. A lot of, similar things you're talking in your book. And you write something in your book. You say, it is easy to convince ourselves that waiting until we have enough information to act is a safe move because we can. For example, avoid wasting money on something that ultimately doesn't succeed, or we can follow the lead of our competitors and end with a comparable market position at a fraction of the cost, similar to what you just stated, Geoff. Unfortunately, as we've examined previously, because of several biases, humans have a bad habit of assuming the future is a linear extension of the past, and thereby also assuming that the same conditions will exist for the fast follower as existed for the first mover. So kind of, adding on to what you spoke about, Geoff, here, and what you kind of wrote about this, how can you talk about this maybe in general terms of AI as a whole, in terms of how we get out of this thinking?
Yeah, and I would even generalize further beyond just AI to adoption of new technologies and new trends in general. So a good example, actually, that we can go back and kind of smile at is how slow the world of marketing was to adopt a digital form of reaching folks, whether it's on social media or other digital means, as opposed to the dominant model of television advertising, right? How many years did we have to know in the back of our minds that people are skipping the ads on their DVR or not watching them in general or not paying attention to, and without it being appropriately measured, to say, well, we don't have any proof that this doesn't work, or we don't have any proof that people are spending more time. We just kind of can observe it, but we didn't have all of the marketing models that told everyone to put their media on television weren't shifted or weren't updated. So to some extent, we were linearly expanding the past. That's the same kind of behavior, because it felt safe to continue doing something that the model said was right, even though basically what we were proving was that the model was no longer a good reflection of society. Now, with things like AI, and you can see in the future, you may not know exactly how AI will make what you're doing potentially better, or perhaps introduce new challenges. But we know that it's probably going to have a role to play in the future. So we think that the smart leaders are testing it early. and they're trying to figure out how to adopt it so that I can make what I'm doing for my customer a little bit better or a little bit cheaper. In Detonate, we tell the story of the tailor who you always had to go for a custom suit to go see a tailor if you wanted custom clothes made. And both my wife and I have enjoyed doing that over time. I do it because I've got like one arm that's longer than the other. And you know, what happens when a company like MTailor comes along and now you can use artificial intelligence to get measured and then have that uploaded into the cloud, and then the use of robotics to actually make the clothes. It creates both a better experience because I don't have to go to a tailor, and a cheaper experience because I've taken a lot of the human labor out of it. The problem is what the tailor generally does, the old school tailor does, is they say, I'm going to improve my customer experience by putting an espresso machine in the waiting room. They try to make a obsolete business model suck a little bit less. And what the business leaders of the future do is that they say, okay, I don't know exactly how AI might work, but I'm going to try it to see and get a better read on the uncertainty and how it might be applied to my business problem.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Again, kind of getting into that mindset of being okay with kind of standing out, I think is somewhat of a challenge, but people like yourself being able to kind of talk about this through your book and help in certain ways. You know, you also suggest, again, there's so much knowledge here in this book. You talk about 3 pieces of critical information to go from the if to the when, which we spoke about a little bit earlier. What are they? And you can talk to them to whatever extent you'd like.
Sure. So the if to when, as I'm sure you saw, Carrie, the way we imagine it in a book is it's kind of it almost looks like a roller coaster where you're building up energy over time, and then you crest a peak where it just becomes a matter of when, and then you release all that energy and get the rewards from having positioned yourself well. So what we posit in the book is that there are 5 different strategies that you can use along the way in that phase change from if to when that really depend on the degree to which you have faith that the uncertainty is going to resolve in a certain way. And I'm happy to go into those 5 things in more detail, but one of the key signals relates back to something that has been in the world of human-centered design and innovation for a long time, called the balanced breakthrough model. And the balanced breakthrough model basically suggests that something becomes, I'm going to overstate it for effect, but something becomes a no-brainer to go and innovate and build on when it hits the intersection of 3 different conditions. It's viable, it's feasible, and it's desirable. And what we mean by that, and I'll go do them in reverse order, desirable means it's desirable to the customer base that you're trying to serve, or it's something that someone would enjoy. It's feasible in terms of we can actually do it, we can create it, we can make this move. And it's viable from a business model perspective, meaning if you're a profit-oriented company, it's likely to turn a profit. And if we now talk about just generally innovation, good innovations and good innovation development processes are always testing one of those 3 components in their development process. And when you hit all 3, when something it shows clear signs of being viable, feasible, and desirable, that's when you know you have a gem that you want to go and create in the world. We think by paying attention to viability, feasibility, and desirability, you can get a better sense for when a trend is going to resolve into being a matter of when, and shift your stance accordingly. And again, the stance has to do with the 5 strategies I talked about before, which really are the heart of the book.
Yeah, and like you said, there's a lot of detail in the book for people to kind of look at. Just a kind of a follow-up question to that, when you're looking at kind of desirability, is there a certain percentage? Do maybe 50% of people have to desire something for it to be considered desirable enough within what you're talking about?
Well, I think that goes back to the viability question. And so if you can have desirability. So for example, let's look at the companies that are taking private citizens to space. For it to be economically viable, the cost is, millions of dollars, and it doesn't have to be desirable to a large number of people. It just has to be affordable to a handful of billionaires who can pay to go into space. That's an example where you get small segments that are desirable, but it's still viable. So it's not a set rule on degree of desirability. It's a function of the cost of the business model that is going to create the level of desirability that's going to be important for your business model.
Got it. That makes sense. There was one other thing in your book that I loved towards the end that you talked about. You talked about all these different tools and different things you should be thinking about. And it kind of was something I wasn't expecting. And you said that, being able to create kind of actionable change, one of the things that's most important is to have fun in your organization. So why is fun important in an organization? What role does it play?
Well, I'm gonna start with this, Steve, and then I'm gonna hand off to you. This is what we were joking before, Carrie, about me sometimes like virtually ripping the mic out of Steve's hand. That's what just happened there, just for the record. So now I've almost forgot what I was going to say. No, so this feels like a very serious topic to people, in part because one of the important recommendations we have in the book is that the way to remove the organizational blinders that are created by those biases is to introduce cognitive diversity into the organization. That's how, and cognitive diversity comes from actual diversity. That feels like a really serious topic to people. And it is a serious topic for a whole variety of different reasons, but it doesn't have to be so serious that you can't actually have fun along the way. And so that's a setup I wanted to give Steve, and I'll give you back the mic. How's that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think at any point in time when human beings get stressed, they tend to check out, right? It's like the fight or flight. So if work isn't fun and it's a chore, then people aren't going to feel like they want to bring their best selves. They're not motivated by it. And so to me, having fun is just a way to make generally serious things and important issues feel lighter. And I think we see that you get better results when you can, we've seen it in the world of technology where you can gamify something, people get better results because human beings by their nature just like to do fun stuff. It's not rocket science. It's like writing a book, could be stressful or it could be fun. And we just chose like, hey, let's have fun to do it. And let's not make it so serious. It doesn't mean that it has to be less relevant. It doesn't have to be boring.
Yeah, I like that. You can still get things done, but making it fun and whatever that means for that person or that organization can be different. So I just love that you added that in there because I wasn't expecting it. And I think it's equally as important, which is why it's part of the book. There's a lot of things we discussed today. There's a lot more in the book. Is there maybe one tip that you can give to listeners that they can kind of take away as an actionable step to their organization today to provoke and kind of do that next level of thinking?
Yeah, well, so I have a tip, but it feels very broad-reaching, I'll hopefully bring it to something that feels very actionable. But the one tip is be more curious. Just have more curiosity in everything you do, and you will be able to actually challenge some of the biases and remove the blinders that I just talked about. One of the ways to be curious is just go try stuff. And one of the things that Steve and I write a lot about is something that we called in Detonate, we called it a minimally viable move, which is the concept is borrowed from the world of product development. Many people have heard of a minimally viable product where you take something early in its development and put it out into the market to get some reaction to it. You can do that with any sort of leadership move, whether you're talking about talent moves or product moves or marketing moves or finance moves. Just boil every hypothesis you have down to its smallest testable component and go do it. Don't do the analysis. Don't go and run around and try to get the data, because increasingly data, which is by definition historical, is not going to be that helpful. The only ways that we can add contours to the uncertainty that are around us is to go try stuff. And so if we can all just get into the mode of trying a little bit more and being a little bit more curious, not only do I think we can stay out in front of that phase change, but that tends to be a little bit more fun too.
Yeah, Carrie, I just want to add one other tip, and Geoff touched on it, but I just want to underscore it a bit, which is diversify your teams and diversify them. What I mean by that is create diversity. Make sure you're being inclusive to the different points of view. Geoff talked about the importance of cognitive diversity, and cognitive diversity has been proven to create better answers to complex and new challenges, because when you have people who think differently about a problem, then they are able to see the stuff that the other people aren't seeing. So all the biases start to some extent cancel each other out. And as a team, you see the contours of the uncertainty a lot better. So that's why diverse teams perform better. And so it's not just a moral imperative, which we think it is, to create diversity and inclusion. And by the way, it has to be coupled with inclusion, because if the folks who are diverse don't feel like their voices are heard, then you don't get the benefit of it. So go and make sure your teams are diverse would be the other actionable tip.
It all starts with, the mindset and the right people. And I'm glad that you're adding that in. I appreciate that. We talked about a lot of things today. If people have questions about anything we talked about, they want to get the book, they want to connect, where is the best place to do that?
Well, they can connect with Geoff or I on social media. I'm at Stephen_Goldbach, Stephen with a V, and Geoff is at Geoff Tuff, with Geoff with a G, no underscore. You can, and we love to get tweeted at, so please do, because we love to be provoked ourselves and debated, and we will engage. And the other thing that you can do is obviously go. You can pick up the book. The easiest thing to do is just Google Provoke the book. It'll show you where to buy it, and also there's a page on our Deloitte landing page where you can get some more information and an excerpt.
Perfect. Well, I thank you both so much, Geoff and Steve, for being here and sharing your insight and your passion for what you do. And I look forward to hearing more in the future.
Thanks for having us on. That was fun.
Carrie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to our ReadSpeaker.AI YouTube channel for other video interviews, as well as our audio podcast, Creative and Tech, wherever you listen to podcasts.